So, where to start? Again, the discussion of race as it exists in our country right now today is extremely important. And I will say it is even to the height of, dealing with the economy and dealing with issues of police brutality and some of the issues that you see that are popping up on a daily basis at this point. In our lives and on our news media and in social media, different things like that. And in the last video, I just kind of touched upon really quickly the fact that we just had the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, where Derek Chauvin was convicted of all three counts that he was alleged. And since the trial, before and since, we've had other occurrences happen in the United States where people have been killed by the hands of the police officer. And of course, each one of those items and those events are different, but the overriding theme is that we are now considering, just like issues of race, whether our police system is doing exactly what it needs to do. Understanding that the police are there to protect and serve. Their job is about preservation of life, not just, quelling crimes or what have you, and certainly not the issue of deadly force in every single case, because we have now seen that there's a disparity there. And so with that as the backdrop to this conversation, and however you may personally feel about that, I want to enter into the discussion of race so that everyone moving forward can have a clearer understanding, if not a clearer conscience, or a better understanding of truth and how that issue of race and racism, institutional racism, might be affecting you personally. With the issue of racism and institutional racism, you can kind of consider it two different things in a way. Racism is more the personal, run-of-the-mill, everyday, how I feel about Black people personally, issues of racism, where systemic racism has more to do, obviously, with a system, a pattern of thinking, historical background and points, and other practices, even as it relates to right now today. And just to insert a little footnote, if you research policing itself and go back as far as you can, you'll find that some of the practices of policing actually started as a slave catching mechanism. So it was not just the idea of, oh, there's crime in my neighborhood and I need someone to call, in order to help me feel safe, or again, to quell some sort of crime that might be happening. Policing actually started as a solution to runaway slaves. Now, just as a side note, I want to insert another question. If you were a slave, would you stay in the circumstances that have been forced and foisted upon you, where you're working for no wages, you're not earning anything, you're beaten, your family is interrupted, as in, you've been raped, your husband is sold to another person in another state, my wife has been taken to another place away from her family, my kids have been sold and separated from me, whatever ideas you have of slavery, for example, in movies that you may have seen, would you yourself as a slave stay in that particular state of living? Most people would say no. I don't know of anyone, Black, white, or otherwise, who would say, sure, you can work me until I'm dead. Sure, you can beat me over the back with your whip, or, brand me with a hot iron, And sure, I'll stay here as your property. Do whatever you want to me. And when you're done with me, I'll somehow figure out how to pull myself up by my bootstraps. Thank you so much for treating me so poorly. No one would do that. So when you again think of the idea of systemic racism, we have to, in America especially, but around the world as well, have to think about how did these things come into being? How did the institution of policing come into being? How did the institution of banking and loans come into being? How did the institution or the industry of finances and accumulating wealth come into being? And when you think about that, as I said in the first video, there are many people from other countries and other places who simply hear of the idea of America and they say, wow, this sounds great. This sounds amazing. I hear they have jobs. I hear they have housing. I hear, there's not a lot of war situations going on like it is in my country. And, there's less of a chance of me being killed or less of a chance of me dying or my family suffering some sort of detriment. So we're going to pack up and go to America. And those same people decided to board a boat or however, and they came to America versus the Black experience, the African American experience, or Africans that were stolen from Africa and brought to the United States against their will, unknowingly, without any kind of prior knowledge, information, or insight as to how their life might be when they arrive. So you want to consider that. And just as I said in the first video, you cannot, in my opinion, do that without, number one, considering the human aspect first. If you were born of a womb and you did not come from the planet Mars, Pluto, Jupiter, or Saturn, or some other planet outside of Earth, everyone walking around on this planet came from a woman's womb. We were all born as humans. You have a human heart that beats in your chest without any assistance from you. That's number one. Number two is your background. None of us have the same background. And I gave the description in the last video that I have a brother and a sister, or I had a brother and a sister who are no longer living. I had a half sister who has always been a part of my life ever since I can remember, and I'm the oldest of my family. And then I had a natural born brother who grew up with me in the same household, born from the same father, born from the same mother. And so our backgrounds are very similar because we have the same parents, we lived in the same household. But even with that, there still can be differences. For example, my brother was an athlete. He excelled at sports. I did not choose to do that. I'm more of a musician and a poet and an author and different things of that sort. So, people who knew us, if they knew us well, they knew those aspects about us. But as I mentioned in the last video, me and my brother look a little bit different from one another. But we grew up in the same house, in the same, culture, in the same belief system and, authority patterns and whatever else, that existed in my mother and father's house. So being human, knowing that there is a difference in background or similarities in background, these are things that, are pretty common as you begin to relate to other people. And then the third thing that we talked about in the last video are, again, attributes or things that you begin to learn or add to yourself. For example, here's another point about me. My brother graduated from college. He actually had a full ride scholarship and graduated with a 3.5 in communications. I have not graduated from college, although I do have some college experience, many years of it. So there's just, again, little subtleties. You would think that someone growing up in the same house would graduate from high school and college, etc. Not always the case. And so that can influence how someone lives out the rest of their life. You have to take that into consideration. So as we begin to deal with the idea of racism and again, systemic racism, you want to look at those things first before you jump right in and say, no, that's not racist, and no, you're wrong, and I'm right, and all of this, because there are a lot more facts that need to be added in. And with that, I would say the fourth point that we'll tackle in this video has a lot to do with experiences. And I'm trying to think of a different word. There's a different word that I use for this category. When you begin to add those things to yourself, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, PhD, Esquire, Mr., Mrs., wealthy, poor, culture A, culture B. There are a lot of things that we begin to add to ourselves, and I think we begin to rely on those things a little more heavily because it kind of orchestrates or kind of forces us to move in a particular direction as it relates to who you think you are as a person and or what you may be pursuing as a career or a profession, and how you want people to perceive you. So with those things, it further categorizes us, it further separates us out in the world, if you will, between the have and the have-nots, between the educated and the uneducated, between the intelligent and the unintelligent. And again, there is, in and of itself, nothing really bad about those things. But what I'm saying is it greatly, greatly, greatly informs who you are as a person right now today, even as you think about your background and where you came from, where you come from. Hence, the book that I wrote, White Fragility and the Subconscious Mind, which is again available on Amazon.com, Lulu.com, LULU.com, and other sites like BarnesandNobles.com, Walmart.com, wherever the book may be found. The two most prominent ones that I'm aware of at this point are Amazon and Lulu.com. So absolutely pick up that book. In this second video, as we start to move a little more into the idea of racism, I have to split it and I have to kind of delineate between this and that, so that you have a very clear understanding that on one hand, I am absolutely talking about your personal experience, your personal thoughts, your personal feelings, and how you feel about Black people. When you see me as a Black individual, a dark-skinned individual, do you feel the need to embrace me as an individual, or do I repel you as an individual upon sight just based on my skin? Again, you may not know anything about me. I haven't yet disclosed my age. I've said a very little bit about my education. I have now mentioned my name, things of that sort, but you're still kind of learning about me. You don't know whether I grew up rich or poor. You don't know if I grew up exclusively in a Black community or not. You're just basically forming an opinion going off of what you see and what you hear, which is valid, but I'm saying there's another step to it that I want you to include, all of those 3 points that I mentioned up to this point. And adding this fourth point of experience, this is where it begins to separate and break down a little bit more into an individual subjective category. And I'll use, for example, the Holocaust. People who, and please forgive me if any of this sounds insensitive, some things that I say are merely for shock value. because I want you to think and I want you to feel and I want you to really take account of your thoughts and your feelings to see how what I'm saying affects you. And if you need paper and pencil to write down, he said this and I felt that, absolutely do it, because it will help you later as we start to unravel some of these things. But as it relates to the Holocaust, the overriding thought, I guess, that I want to insert is in Russia, in Germany, or what have you, there was this guy named Hitler who, as a leader, decided to, and I'm saying this in a very simplistic manner just so you can get it, decided to launch a hate campaign against people who were not like him or who he felt was inferior. Now, the Black experience or the African American experience versus the experience of the Holocaust or Jewish people is slightly different, because Hitler developed this hatred from wherever within himself, given, he's a human being and he has a background. And number three, he started to add things to himself, because I'm a powerful leader. I should do this or I should do that. I should say this or I should say that, even just to make himself look good, if that was part of what his intention was at that time. I don't know. But the people that he developed this hatred for were not visibly, in terms of appearance, like me necessarily. And I said this in the last video. Upon meeting another human being, again, you don't know anything about me until I tell you. You don't know what my name is. You don't know what my age is. None of that. The most obvious thing about me is my skin color. I'm Black. I'm African American, whichever you choose. And that is undisputed. In fact, that is never going away. So people who say, well, I don't see color, that's a lie. It's a complete misnomer that you should get rid of today, because you do see color. And in fact, as I said a moment ago, upon seeing color, you should be able to decide whether you want to embrace it or decide whether it repels you. If it repels you, that is the very seed of racism. Why should the appearance of another person repel you or sicken you or anger you, and you don't know anything about them at all whatsoever? Yet we have someone like Hitler who, for whatever his reasons were, decided that Jewish people don't belong. So let me do something about it. So racism becomes that thought or that action that you begin to play over and over again, you begin to act upon, you begin to rehearse as part of who you are, as if to say, hi, my name is such and such, I'm a PhD and I'm racist. Hi, my name is such and such, I'm a marine biologist and I'm racist. Hi, my name is such and such and I'm wealthy and I'm a racist. That's in essence what Hitler did. And as a result, we all know about the Holocaust and the countless millions of lives that were taken, that were robbed, killed, that were executed, that were removed from this planet because of one person's ideology and the system that supported it. So again, personal racism, however Hitler felt about Jewish people, whatever, we can more or less say that he was the author of the idea. And as a result of being the author of that idea, he created a system to support it. And we had Gestapo, we had, people, soldiers breaking into houses in the middle of night, taking families out of their bed, rounding them up, sending them to concentration camps, putting them on, trains to destinations they knew nothing about, against their will. It became a whole structure, infrastructure, a whole system, a whole dynamic that began to play out in the society, whether Hitler was there or not. All he did was inspire the belief or the thought, and he employed people to carry out his whim and his wishes. And so it is with African Americans, the same type of story. I'm not saying it's the exact same thing, and I'm not even per se comparing the struggles, although they are important. Again, number 4, experiences. We're going to touch on it a bit more. But the fact that there were a group of people who were brought into this situation that was not of their own creating. Who wants to be killed in a Holocaust? Who wants to be stolen from their country and transported on ships to another country? That's the basic thought that I'm going off of. And so getting to that 4th point of experiences, now you have people, African-American people, who are now on this country who don't speak their native language anymore, or in fact are not allowed to, are not given the opportunities to thrive, educate themselves, vote, etc. And here's, again, some personal experience. My grandparents, who were born, my grandfather was born in Alabama, and my grandmother was born in Georgia. My grandfather only had about an 8th grade education, and my grandmother, I believe, only had about a 6th grade education. I don't know all of the details surrounding that, but just from my own personal knowledge, from what I understand, via stories, etc., is that, when they were younger, as Black people in this country, they could not go to school, or they chose not to go to school because they had to work and support their family, etc. I have a little bit of historical knowledge about my grandmother's side of the family, and I think I have an idea of who the slave owner may have been in that family tree, which I won't get into right now, but I do have some knowledge about that. So that's knowledge that I've kind of heard or gleaned or, was told to me, etc., versus this right here, which is a personal story. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, at different times we would go, as we say, down south to visit some of my relatives. In this particular case, we were going to visit my grandfather's sister, who, in my mind, the image in my mind was kind of like arriving up to almost like a shanty type house. It was a big house, but it was just not a well-made house like the house that I grew up in Ohio. And it was a long drive to get onto the property. So I don't know if it was 1 acre or 50 acres, I don't know. But on the way to this aunt's house, my grandfather was driving his car. My mother was in the front passenger seat. My grandmother was in the back seat with me and my brother. Now, I didn't know this at the time, being 8 or 9 years old, but my grandmother, whenever we would take a trip, would always pack like a picnic basket. And they usually had like this large jar so that, if one of us needed to go to the bathroom, number 1, if you will, not number 2, but if we needed to go number 1, we, as little kids, they would typically have us do that in the car in this bottle, which seemed completely normal to me at the time. That's what I knew. And I'll get to the reason I say that in a moment. But as we're driving, my grandfather, in his rearview mirror, saw a policeman put on his lights and his siren, and he pulled over. Now, this that I'm about to say, I have never before or since seen this happen with my grandfather. When he pulled the car over, he immediately turned around and talked to everyone in the car in a very strong, very gruff voice. And my grandfather was kind of well known for being a big guy and, so on and so forth and whatever. But his tone, I'll never forget it. He turned around and he said, "Don't anybody say anything. Be quiet. Don't say a word. You hear me?" And paraphrasing, it was something to that effect. And it shook me because my grandfather didn't talk like that on a regular basis, especially not to us as his little grandchildren who he loved dearly. And then the policeman came up and he rolled down his window and he began talking to my grandfather. And the policeman, at least 3 or 4 times that I can remember in my mind, the police officer called my grandfather a boy. "Where are you going, boy?" Where you were, driving kind of fast and, whatever the police officer said. But it was just the fact that I'm a boy, I'm a little kid, that this grown man is calling my grown grandfather, a boy. And the fact that my grandfather was very meek. He went from the opposite of what he just displayed a moment ago. "Be quiet." He immediately went to, "Yes, sir. No, sir. No, I'm not speeding. Yes, sir. I'm just, on my way down south," almost speaking in a whisper. "I'm, going down south to see my family, see my sister." And it just blew my mind at 8 or 9 years old. And here I am, a full grown adult with my gray beard and all of that. I'm able to recall that moment like it was yesterday. I can literally see it in my mind as I'm telling you the story. And so how does that frame my mind as a young child who, as a grown person, now has to deal with the police? The thought of that immediately comes into your mind without any effort. And this, as I stated in the first video, is part of that subconscious part of yourself, because the police officer wasn't speaking to me directly. And I was kind of more or less a fly on the wall, just hearing what was going on. But based upon what my grandfather said and his actions and how I know my grandfather to be, normally he'd be like, "Oh, baby, don't do that or don't do this," versus "I told you not to do that." That was not a normal tone for me dealing with or experiencing my grandfather. And so our experiences begin to shape us, even beyond those things that we add to ourselves. "Well, I'm Dr. So-and-so," or "I'm rich, I'm that, I'm Oprah Winfrey," whatever you want to add to it. Your experiences begin to color how you encounter the world, whether that be in a positive fashion or in a negative fashion, whether that be in a racist fashion or whether that be in a non-racist fashion. And so when you look at your experiences, it immediately becomes this subjective thing that, especially as adults, we learn to wash over, because again, it may not affect our daily life. When I make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which side of the bread should it go on? It just doesn't matter. But when you're relating to another human being, heart to heart, flesh to flesh, face to face, life to life, those experiences absolutely 1,000,000% matter. And as it relates to an African American person, maybe speaking to their white counterpart, friend, brother, sister, confidant, coworker, whatever, an African American person many times will have their own experiences and stories to tell. And so this is the part where for white America, as it relates to white racism or white privilege or white supremacy, things like that, you really have to develop an ear to hear. You really have to be an active listener to just get an understanding of where that person may be coming from. And I'll insert quickly here a little term that I often say: there's no tapping out. You can't tap out. If this is a person that you care about, if this is a person that you're around on a frequent basis, you, number one, can't dismiss their skin. Oh, I don't see you as Black. I don't see color. And two, you can't dismiss their experiences, because it again influences how they even relate to you as an individual. If this is someone that you call a friend, and let's say you've never had this friend over your house for dinner, but you happen to, invite them to dinner, or you go to their house and you suddenly don't know how to feel, you don't know how to act, or you don't know how to relate to them because you're outside of the job, or you're outside of your neighborhood, or outside of your normal surroundings. That is a key. That should be a red flag, a siren going off in your mind, that this is a point of relating that you need to exercise. One, as a human. Two, because you have different backgrounds. Three, because you have attributes that you add to yourself that are probably could be completely different from yourself. If there are similarities, like, oh, you're Black and you have a PhD, I have a PhD as well. Okay, great. That's another point that you have in common. But then the fourth thing of experience, you're not going to find someone who fits squarely within your little box world, or what you perceive to be your daily existence. And so along with the idea of, the Holocaust and things that I mentioned, personal racism versus systemic racism, now you can insert that there is a difference that starts to, again, be like a small plant that begins to grow into a larger weed, where your experiences subconsciously begin to challenge you and give you a perception or a thought that somehow you're different or better or higher or what have you. And you have to learn to debunk that within yourself so that you can honestly get a proper perception of the person that's across from you. And so here you want to, again, kind of decide whether this is internal or external. Is it personal? Is it systemic? And really see how hearing and perceiving that other person's perception brings more light and understanding to you. And when that person tells you a story or shares a truth about themselves, how you're able to embrace that, how you're able to reconcile that in your mind, as opposed to, and I'm working up to this, without being defensive is the best way to put it. Being called a racist, if I can say it this way, should not be an offensive thing. I say that because someone calling you a racist may just be trying to highlight something that you have said or done that makes them, feel bad, is offensive to them, or what have you. And it's very subjective because all of us have certain things that, we like or don't like. For example, my name is Douglas. There are a very, 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 very small group of people that call me Dougie. And some people, just because they know the rapper, they will try and call me Dougie Fresh. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but it doesn't make me get angry, and it doesn't make me want to get into a fist fight with that person. My name is not Dougie. I may just have to correct them. Well, I have had many people call me that, but I really prefer to be called Douglas or Doug, as well, those who know me extremely well know my mother's nickname for me, which is Douglas. And I will absolutely answer to that. That's almost like saying honey, baby, sweetie to me. And so, because my mother gave me the gift of that little nickname, there are some people who absolutely know that about me and will call me that, or variations of that, because some people don't really know how to pronounce it. And so even as a result of that nickname, I kind of use it for everything, which I'll say a little bit later in the program, as well as right now. If you ever want to send me an email, my email is duglaglas@aol.com. That's DUGLAIGLAS@aol.com. And so Douglas is something that I do recognize. Douglas, Doug, or Douglas. Those are my three names that I prefer to be called. I do not always like Dougie. I do not like Dougie Fresh, etc. Guy, buddy, boss, dude. I don't like none of those. And so, as it relates to relating and getting to know a person, that fourth level of experience, you have to understand their world and where they're coming from, and you cannot be arrogant, narcissistic, ego-centered, and say that you don't care or it doesn't matter. Now, Black Lives Matter. Let's throw this in here. And Blue Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter came about as Black people were reeling within themselves, trying to figure out slavery has ended and we're moving forward in life to try and thrive and grow and be better or whatever. But we keep running into this issue of police brutality on top of systemic racism, personal racism, financial disparities, centuries of atrocities that have happened to Black people, lynchings, non-education, not being able to read, not being able to vote. In order to vote, you have to guess how many beans are in the jar, jelly beans are in the jar, and things of that sort. All that stuff is kind of down towards the bottom, and it largely exists in a subconscious way for Black people. But the top of that iceberg, the visible part of the iceberg for us today is absolutely 1,000,000,000,000,000% police brutality, education, job disparities, even things like they have a Black sounding name, so I'm going to file their resume in file 13. It's a number of things. It's quite infinite. But what I'm saying is Black Lives Matter came into existence as a rallying cry, as a pulling together effort for Black people to begin to deal with the idea of police brutality. Police who are supposed to protect and serve. Police who are supposed to preserve life and give care. For example, in the situation with George Floyd, it's not just that he did this or he did that, but you laid him on the ground for 9 minutes and 29 seconds and you were kneeling, putting your weight on top of him to add to whatever medical issues he may or may not have had, blah, 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 blah. But as at the point that you see that this man is in medical distress, it is the obligation of the police to render aid. Even if he shot George Floyd in the foot, you're still obligated to call the paramedics to deal with this injury, which Chauvin clearly, obviously did not do. And so 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 seconds. At what point does it become depraved? At what point does it become wrong? At what point does it become criminal? So that's that issue. And so people who, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group and Black Lives Matter, is bad and Black Lives Matter is wrong. All lives matter. Please, please understand the issue. Black people are not saying that all lives don't matter. In fact, I said in the last video, every single person walking around on the planet of Earth sprang from a person of color. So largely, we see white people and other ethnicities as kind of like an extension of ourselves. The only difference is that Black people have become accustomed to the evilness, the evil that we see some white people or some institutions executing or developing, employing, whatever. Again, Hitler, you might want to say, was a racist. And then from his own ideologies, he developed a system that supported it. Black Lives Matter is just saying, we don't want this kind of system in our American culture, in our American country. It does not support who we are. And so we're highlighting the issues using the term Black Lives Matter. The same thing with Colin Kaepernick when he would take a knee. It is nothing against the American flag or the national anthem or any of that. He was using his First Amendment right to protest as a way to bring attention to these issues that I'm talking about. And his way of doing that was simply taking a knee. Now, Blue Lives Matter. Blue Lives Matter really sprang up as a direct result and even a contradiction to Black Lives Matter. So that immediately should inform you and tell you that if before Black Lives Matter ever came onto the scene, if Blue Lives Matter didn't exist and police, felt so strongly that they would probably, be saying that, or publishing that, and people would be aware of what that is. But the fact that it was created in direct contradiction to Black Lives Matter is the same as saying all lives matter. That is not the point. And I'll make it even more clear for you. Being Black is not my profession. Being Black is not my occupation. Being Black is not something that I take off at night when I go home, versus a police officer, Blue Lives Matter, who when they get home, they take off their badge, they lay down their gun, they take off their holster, they take off their blue shirt, they take off their vest, they take off whatever uniform they're wearing. There's nothing wrong with being in a group or any of that. Again, that's point number 3, things that we add to ourselves. I'm a fraternity person. I'm a sorority person. I'm involved in this group, or I go to this church. I'm a Christian. I'm Jewish. I'm Catholic. I'm whatever. These are all things that you kind of add to yourself, and your education is included in that category. So Blue Lives Matter is not a living, breathing, birth to death proclamation. It is only a fraternity or a group that people feel an affinity to, which is fine. But you cannot or should not use that as a weapon against someone else, because that again is some of the fruits of racism. That small plant starting to grow into a weed is starting to spread like a cancer. Black Lives Matter is just saying, we want equality. We want what America promised us: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everyone equal under the law. You know, these unalienable rights, you know, that all men are created equal. That's what Black Lives Matter is talking about. Blue Lives Matter is only saying, we don't want to die, or our job is hard, or we have the right to shoot you, or, you know, whatever other confession they may be publishing. But even with that, there are standards, there are rules, there are policies, and an oath that has been put in place that police officers are to protect and serve. And everyone understands that. Along with that, police have, because I'm kind of thinking of one of the thoughts that I said before, the idea of policing actually started way back during slave times with the idea of slave catching. And so that outdated thought cannot exist in 2021. It should not, it dare not exist in 2021. But even with that, the idea of policing and understanding that people are, you know, have differences, there's cultural differences, etc. How you as a police officer deals with your job and all of that. Of course the job is hard. Of course the job is dangerous. And if you as a police officer, when you put on your uniform, are scared, you're afraid to go out and deal with people, confront issues, etc., to the point that you feel like you need to use your gun every single time, you are in the wrong profession. Absolutely wrong profession. I don't care if your grandfather did it. I don't care if your great-grandfather did it. You're in the wrong profession, because you have to have the heart. You have to have the spirit of service. And I feel that you should have the ability to communicate to people. Again, using George Floyd, for a fake $20 bill that he may not have known he had, when the police was called, if you saw the videos during the trial, they go up to him in his car, and within 5 seconds of tapping on his window, the police have their gun drawn and they're yelling obscenities and yelling instructions, as opposed to, excuse me, sir, we received a call from the Cup Foods here across the street that a fake $20 bill was passed, and we need to ask you some questions about that. In fact, we may have to place you under arrest, but based on what I understand, they didn't even need to, you know, place him under arrest. It could have been almost like a traffic ticket situation where, you know, they gave him a ticket, you know, where he needed to pay it or appear in court or what have you. But because none of us, not all of us, are police officers, we assume that the police officers know what to do. And so there are a great many people who, when they encounter the police, we assume that the police officer is going to do the right thing. We assume that the police officer is not racist. We assume that the police officer is not having a bad day, or that the police officer has had three, experiences prior to engaging you that were negative or dangerous or whatever, and he's not carrying that whole baggage into this current situation with you as a person, pulling you over on the side of the road because you have a broken tail light, or because your sticker is expired, or for whatever, you were swerving on the road, whatever the excuse is. We assume that the police officer on each encounter is going to act justly and is going to act with compassion and understanding, even within a dangerous situation. They've been trained. They're the ones with all the force. They have the guns, and they cannot assume that the average person that they're pulling over knows the ins and outs of their job, of every aspect of their job. And so, again, there has to be this reconciling of differences, or understanding of differences, or embracing differences. One, you're talking to another human being, so they're worthy automatically of your respect, your dignity, your, whatever you want to add into that equation. Number two, their background is different from yours. So unless that person was raised in a family of police officers and they started police training at the age of 6, chances are that person probably doesn't have the same makeup or experience or perception that you do about being a police officer. Number 3, the attributes, where you have gone through the training, you are now a police officer, you wear a badge, you have a gun, et cetera, et cetera. Most people who are not police officers, have not gone through that training, don't know anything about that at all. No more than they would know about being the mayor of their city. No more than they would know about being a surgeon. No more than they would know about being an architect, if they were not trained in those areas. And then the 4th thing is the experience, the very thing that I'm speaking to. So when you encounter another human being, it should not automatically lead to some sort of detrimental, deathly, fatal encounter, especially at the hands of someone who's been trained to deal with these things. You've been trained in de-escalation. You've been trained in weaponry. You've been trained in passive and aggressive behavior. There's a whole, excessive force continuum, as I learned about it, during the Chauvin trial. And deadly force is absolutely the last thing on the list. If I have a gun as a citizen and I'm shooting at you as a police officer, deadly force is warranted. Sometimes, not always. You have to judge it. But if I'm running away from you or standing still, or even just arguing with you with my words, because I may not understand, I may be having a bad day or whatever, that is not, I repeat, definitively, that is not a reason for any police officer to be using deadly force if deadly force has not been used against you. And so, having said all that, you see that the 4th point of experiences really begins to color how another person might perceive someone else. As well, it's a thing that can inform you about the person. You may not know much about them, you're just getting to know them. And so you engage with that person. You listen to that person, and it's a two-way street. It's just not a one-way street. But I'm saying, as it relates to Black experiences, how Black people feel about racism, we don't hate white people. We hate evil. And so you have to decide for yourself, am I acting in an evil fashion? Is there something that I do or something that I think that causes me to think evil thoughts or causes me to want to act upon evil thoughts? I had a bad experience with 3 Black people 15 years ago. And that one bad experience now tells me that I hate all Black people. All Black people are, should be killed. You're giving way to a very evil thought based on an experience, one experience that may not even have a pattern. You have moved beyond the idea of prejudice into something much more deadly and fatal. You're moving absolutely into the realm of prejudice, of racism. And so you have to really grapple with that as it relates to, you're talking and dealing with your Black friends and understanding that they're coming from a particular place historically and currently. When we break it down into more bite-sized chunks, the elephant in the room, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? These are the things that you begin to employ. And again, you can't tap out. You can't be like, oh, you told me 2 stories and I can't stand to hear it. I don't want to hear anymore, and you run away from the person, you run away from the situation. If this is someone that you care about, number one, or if this is something that you are trying to embrace, number 2, you have to be willing to have the uncomfortable conversation. It is absolutely difficult on both sides, because just as I'm telling you a story about my grandfather, it's painful. And I feel the emotions of it even right now as I'm telling it to you. And for me to share that with you and you dismiss me, well, you have just disrespected me. You have offended me. You have shown me your evil side, and you've let me know in uncertain terms that you really just don't care. Like I could die tomorrow and it's not a big deal for you. So what? It's not me. Oh, well. And so as I conclude this video, it starts to deal with the idea of white privilege, white supremacy, and even elitism. I'm not like you, so I'm better. I'm not Black, so I don't have to care. And that is absolutely some of the underlying definitions of white privilege or white power, because your presence in the world as a white person says that you don't have to care. Your white presence in the world says to others that I don't even recognize that I came from Black people myself. No one's trying to trap you or hold you, into now becoming a Black person. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying from a human standpoint, all of us have more things in common than we consciously realize. And so you have to begin consciously. You have to begin to consciously realize that there are 10 similarities that we have in common versus the 3 that we don't. And upon seeing me as a Black person or a brown person, you shouldn't be repelled. if anything, you should immediately feel the opposite and want to embrace who I am, what I'm about, where I'm from. You know, just like you learn a foreign language, and I love foreign languages. Je parle un peu français. You know, j'ai étudié le français il y a 5 années, at least. I love languages, and I hope to learn many. And so when I learn French, or as I'm learning Spanish, or as I'm learning Chinese, you know, part of learning that language is embracing that culture. It's not just and only about learning that language, although that is absolutely possible. But in order to learn a language effectively, you have to know their phraseology. You have to know their terminology. You have to know their rules of grammar, etc. For example, an English person may say, "I'm chuffed." That's not something that we say in the United States. Or I had a friend from England who many years ago, we were having a group discussion of a bunch of different people, and the English person in the group was telling a story, and she said, "That brought me up sharp." Which I was like, what? You know, because it's just not an expression that we use. And so you learn what that means, or you learn what that is. The same can be said for every Black person in your life. And if you don't have a Black person in your life, again, that's another red flag. That's a signal. That's an alert that you need to change some things up. And in the videos coming up, we'll kind of go into some of that, because it's really not that difficult when you are in the presence, physically in the presence of another Black person, that you say, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Or, "Let me ask you a question." It's no different than seeing a movie or a television show, and you say, "Hey, have you seen this? Did you see that? Or did you like that? What'd you think about that?" It's really no different. The only thing I'm saying is, don't tap out. You can't hear one or two stories and then decide you're done. You're fed up, you're sickened, you can't take it. You know, that's too much of a sign of disrespect. If the person wants to dialogue with you, you dialogue with them. If you want to make yourself available to that person, allow that person to make themselves available to you. And the best way to do that is to show them that you care, is to show them that you're listening and that you hear them. You don't need to respond. You don't need to come back. You don't need to give a retort. You don't need to overanalyze what they're saying. So let me see, what you're saying to me is, they just told you what they're saying. And so as a person, a friend, a caring, supportive character, you just take it in, you absorb it, and you let it soak into you. And whether that be on the spot or later, you then assess for yourself, what do you think? How do you feel? And if that person that you're talking to is open to that, maybe you can share that with them. Because in some cases, they may have an explanation or a correction. They may say, "Well, that's racist. Don't be offended." Or like I said earlier about someone calling me out of my name. If someone calls me Dougie Fresh, I'm not going to get into a fist fight with them. I'm just going to say, "Well, I like the fact that you think that that's cool, but I prefer to be called Doug or Douglas. I do not like Dougie Fresh." It's really that simple, and you have to get to that point. So as I'm concluding this video, I want to again make you all aware that, you know, there are other videos that are going to be coming, and I want you all to share this on your social media and with other people. I want you to go on lulu.com or amazon.com and order the book, White Fragility and the Subconscious Mind. And as well, if there are any questions or thoughts, anything that you want to share with me, absolutely, you can share it to my email, which I'll give to you right now. If you have pencil and paper and ready to write it down, I would love to hear from you, what you think, what you feel, questions that you may have, etc., experiences you want to share, stories you want to tell, all of it. And so that email is douglagless@aol.com, and I'll spell it for you. That is DUGLAIGLAS@aol.com. Again, DUGLAIGLAS@aol.com. And I would love to hear from you guys. So again, remember, human, background, attributes, and experiences in that order. And if you can practice that in your life, I think you will encounter a lot more beneficial, beautiful, blossoming racial relations, experiences, friendships, etc. in your life. But please stay tuned to the next video, because we want to get a little bit more into the subject matter. And if you have things that you want me to talk about or explain, etc., send me an email so I can know what those things are and I can prepare myself to speak with you. Until the next time, have a great day. It was great speaking with you. God bless. Bye-bye.